Okay. All right, so as you guys are writing this out, we're going to do a little recap of last week's class. So what we did last week was we reviewed the historical development of science. We covered the 4 different philosophies of science: mechanism, formism, organicism, and contextualism. And what was important to take out of the differences between these 4, or what makes these 4 special, is that these philosophies of science come before you actually do any science. They're the assumptions that are not provable. It's not as though science is like, truth. In fact, all 4 of these have different definitions of truth, and each had different metaphors of how they look at how the world is put together, how it operates. Some emphasized the whole as opposed to parts. Others emphasized that reality is experienced by 2 factors, or man and God, let's say, coming together and making a shared creation, a shared reality, as opposed to reality is a copy that you just do your best to copy. Simple as that. I highlighted how Judaism has a strong contextualistic bent to it, meaning that the way that we look at reality is very much based on relationship, that man and God are co-creators of reality. And I also pointed out that there's a strong phenomenological bent to Judaism. What that means is that Judaism puts more truth in what's experienced directly with our senses. And it's what's really cool about kind of having these pieces in front of you is because basically every conflict between Torah and science becomes stupid. It's not just it answers those problems, it makes it fundamentally dumb questions to ask. Because, when you put Torah and science together, what's science? We have to clarify that. No one ever does that. I challenge you. You guys have probably never heard any, because they give Torah science classes, they're a common thing. No one ever defines what science is. They need to. That would be one of the four philosophies of science. What are the limits of science? And generally, all these conflicts that exist between the two center around, science has all these assumptions that are not necessarily provable, and Judaism does make truth claims. So it's not necessarily contradictions as, Judaism is kind of like its own philosophy of science. And I pointed out one major reason why Stephen Pepper, who wrote, who's one of the most influential philosophers on the philosophy of science, one reason why he wrote his book was basically this problem, is because when you talk with people, generally you're not talking with people. Most conflicts in life, especially, not just science, but just in your lives, most debates are really pseudo-debates. It's going to usually be that one person has one way of looking at the world, one philosophy of science, and another person has another philosophy of science. They can't speak with one another. They don't overlap. So you'll have people yelling and screaming and hollering, but no real discussion actually takes place. If you want to have a real debate with somebody, you have to adopt their philosophy, you have to adopt their perspective to then be able to say anything constructive, to actually discover things. Because like I said, otherwise you're just at loggerheads. There's no common ground. At the very end of the course, I really wanted to highlight something cool, is that science itself, has these philosophies, but there's also this sort of meta aspect to science that comes straight out of religion. That it was people like Ibn Ezra, the Rishonim, who, because Torah doesn't pay so well, their day job was translating texts. And these guys jumping around from Spain into France, there was some cross-pollination, so to speak, of ideas, and people like Ibn Ezra actually just translated these Greek philosophical works from Arabic to both Latin and Hebrew. That's why we have philosophy today, because of people like Ibn Ezra. And what they put into, it wasn't just they also just made a straight copy. A lot of these Rishonim and also their Muslim counterparts put in religious ideas into the beginnings of philosophy. And it's those religious ideas that there is truth, there is order, and that man can make meaning out of the world. Those are fundamental religious beliefs that were snuck into philosophy, that were eventually snuck into science. They were snuck into science. So science on a fundamental level is kind of religious, or actually very religious. Okay. And all this was kind of culminating and presenting to you guys this idea that what the Rambam was doing with the 13 principles of faith was he was translating amuna, which is a experienced thing, something that is not something that was threatened by the development of science because the way we looked at the world was changing. And all the Rambam did was he translated the experience of amuna to a science of amuna. Those are the 13 principles of faith. Like a good researcher, he operationalized the term. That's what you do when you do any research papers. You operationalize what you're studying. That's what the Rambam did. He saved amuna by making these 13 principles of faith so that people like you and me, modern man, could actually relate to it. Okay. One idea I wanted to extend a little further that I mentioned in last class, and then we'll actually dive into the first of the 13 principles, was the idea that you learn a lot from the name of religion. I put forward, well, you learn what's important to them, and we went through the list of different religions. Another way of putting it is the name a religion gives itself is the answer to the problem it's trying to solve. And so if you can break down the etymology of a name of religion, you can kind of backtrack and figure out what problem is it trying to solve, what does it ultimately value. It's the same thing. So taking religions like Catholicism, Christianity, the problem that it fundamentally is trying to solve is lack of belief and lack of unity. Catholicism means universalism. Universalism of ideas, which means, the world doesn't believe what they believe. That's the problem they're trying to solve, which is why Christianity has a major missionary bent to it. They have to make everyone believe what they believe. That's what they find valuable. Total unity. Protestants, that's just in the name. The problem they're trying to solve is everything that came before them. And Islam, again, we said that the word itself means submitting oneself, or submission. Well, the problem that they're trying to solve is hubris and arrogance. That's what they view the fundamental problem of life is, being arrogant people. And Buddhism, awakening, the problem there is being asleep, not noticing the world around you. Now, Judaism doesn't offer a value. It doesn't offer a solution like all of these. Am Yisrael, the name of our religion, translates something along the lines of the people that will struggle with God. And so what's kind of cool is that within Judaism, we don't really necessarily put one value over another. We don't put one answer to the problems of life over another. Instead, the solution to life is to constantly struggle with it. Values are very dangerous. Because as soon as you pick a single value in your life, everything else has to conform. Everything else is an enemy to your value. And certain values, when they become too big, they might sound really good on a small scale, but end up destroying life itself. The idea of fairness is a great example of that. You look at communism. Communism worked great in a family. Everything needs to be fair with the kids, otherwise you're going to mess your kids up. If you have a favorite child, guess what happens to everyone else? They form a complex. They're not going to do well in life if everyone knows, Sally's the one we all love, and I wish you'd measure up to her. Why can't you be more like your brother? That destroys kids. Fairness is an important value in a family. But on a national level, that just heaps up bodies. 600 million people dead. And so what I kind of like about about how Judaism answers the problem of life is, well, it kind of puts it like this. It says, no, well, like the problem of life is not necessarily having one value. It's constantly struggling with life itself. It's constantly exploring. The more that you explore, the better your life is going to be. And I mean, what's really cool about this is that this mirrors our very biology, that we're meant to be explorers. The right side of our hemisphere senses danger. It kind of, if our brain kind of, the right hemisphere puts together, patterns and says, okay, wait a second, watch out what's in front of you. And your left hemisphere, the left hemisphere of your brain, puts data together, pushes you to explore. And on a biological level, you're always pushing against fear to figure out or try and get around it to make more sense of your life. And we're always doing that all the time, every second. I mean, what's kind of interesting about fear is, like, a lot of the early behavioralists, when they were doing all their crazy abusive animal studies, was they originally thought that fear was a response, something that you could stimulate into a living organism. That's not true at all. There's actually no on button to fear. We're always afraid. The reason why we're not afraid is because there's the limbic system, which kind of governs fear, gets suppressed. And it only gets suppressed when you explore. And you're only going to be afraid when something new comes into your life. So it's a paradox. You're always dancing between suppressing fear, because the less afraid you are, the more likely it is you're going to explore. But as you explore, the more afraid you're going to become. So as long as you're struggling, as long as you don't give up, as long as you keep pushing forward, well, that's actually what a healthy life looks like. What's really weird is that the difference between mental health, being mentally healthy, and not, is how you hold fear. That when people avoid what's frightening to them, well, cortisol, which is a chemical in your body, just skyrockets. It's toxic. It eats away at your very soul. That's what makes a person mentally unwell. Constantly running away from what frightens them. But what's weird is that you can have the same sort of fears, but when you confront them, that chemical cortisol doesn't actually get introduced into the body. Nothing's wearing you out. I mean, cortisol takes years off your life. It's not a small thing to be afraid. It's not just mental health, but it's health. Decimates the immune system. But when you confront what's afraid, when you confront what is fearful, what you are afraid of, well, that's how you grow. That's how you feel good. I think this is kind of, this idea of how we hold fear is a little bit, I think what the mitzvah of fearing Hashem kind of gets at, is like you always fear the unknown automatically. Like automatically, you have to. That's what fear is. Fear is, there's something I don't know, okay, watch out. And in order to have a healthy relationship with Hashem, well, don't avoid Him. Don't run away. It's something to explore. And it's like that little pivot of going towards the thing which is infinite, going towards the thing which is unknown. Well, number one, you treat it like it's not going to hurt you, which is a good idea. You'll become more curious. You'll actually be able to grow as a human being. But you spare yourself a lot of heartache living in fear. I think that's Yiras Hashem. Willingly going towards the unknown and exploring it. And it has an edge to it. Like if you don't feel like you're just a little bit coming apart when you're exploring religious ideas, you're not really exploring them. Now you don't want to induce becoming psychotic, but you have to keep both feet on the ground. This is kind of like the idea of why people hesitate to teach Kabbalah. Those ideas are very novel. They're very interesting. And if a person doesn't have both feet on the ground, first learning a lot of halacha, you get lost in those ideas and you kind of get weird. First you get weird and then you get messed up. So, okay, today, it's people do tread carefully when they're teaching it, but it's kind of like, know what comes first. That's kind of the message I'm giving. The last idea I think is pretty cool, is that religion is not found on the lone, the lonely man on the lonely mountain. You only get to be religious. You only get to encounter God with other people. I wish I could track down this story, but my Rosh Hashiva, I told a story about this. They have these religious conferences every now and again, and they kind of come together and they try and form some sort of like resolution that all of the different religions, want to come up with some sort of, we resolve ourselves to ... and in this one particular event, someone raised their hand and said, there was a Buddhist who was presiding. It makes the story a little more interesting. But so someone raises their hand and says, maybe the resolution we should put forward is imbuing spirituality into the world. Most religions don't buy into that. Christianity doesn't. Life is pain, and you just kind of like suck it up until you die, and that's basically the religion. Buddhism definitely doesn't buy into that, because Buddhism is trying to reduce the individual and the individual sense of self, and to reduce the individual's connection to the world, kind of making things equal. It's kind of a weird way of trying to connect with the world by making nothing have value. It really is, Judaism is one of the few religions that actually tries to seek putting spiritual ideas in the living world, in society, in human relationships, with people. That's why, that's why we have halacha and other religions don't, because it's trying to fundamentally, getting back to the previous class we were talking about, is trying to work out what it means to love. So what's really interesting is, you only can figure out God by having other people around. And it's not just having other people around, but having other people around, they fill in your blind spot. There are things you simply can't see. Getting back to the discussion about philosophy of science, people really do see the world in different ways. And this is kind of like the idea of Elu ve'elu, that in order to have a more full picture of God, you have to have someone else there who challenges you and pushes you to see things that would have been impossible for you to see otherwise. A similar idea, way this idea lives in the world. People who make businesses, generally, people who are entrepreneurs and innovators, their personality type is they're extremely open and creative people. And they are extremely low on something called conscientiousness. They're bad at keeping schedules. They're bad at keeping order. And so it's really great they made the business. They're the only ones who could have thought it up. But there's a certain point, as the business is getting bigger and bigger, well, the fact that they're not conscientious is now a liability. Google, that's a great example. Those guys are open and curious, like Zuckerberg and all those guys. They are beyond belief open and curious. But they needed to hire people who were extremely conservative, people who were extremely close-minded, people who were extremely conscientious, just to make the business work. And you need both sorts of people to make business work. So the same thing is true of religion as well.
I think so, it could be both.
You'll have variation. You'll have some people who are on the cusp.
My dad
Yeah.
has this company, he's broke.
Yeah.
He's a planner, but he has a creative mind.
Yeah. You have people like that. You definitely have people like that. Okay. So, in the spirit of that, in the spirit of exploration, trying to hold problems, struggle with them. Let's get to the first principle. The first ikar is about the existence of God. In Perek Chelik, Sanhedrin, so it's the 10th Perek, there in Mishnayos, the Rambam takes a huge detour. Usually the Rambam's explanation, his commentary on the Mishnah is very, very short. So it's like all of a sudden there's a book just like sitting right in front of you before he dives in. And it's this particular chapter in Sanhedrin that deals with who has a chelek and olam haba. And it's here where the Rambam outlines his 13 principles of faith. I know I wasn't able to send it to you guys, so I'm just going to kind of provide a summary of what he writes there. Because he basically puts down that this first principle is that God exists, and that this existence is not contingent on anything. It's not dependent on anything. While all other things that exist are contingent. We depend on God to be alive. Without God, we cease to exist. He's perfect in every way, and he's the reason for all existence. He's eternal, and he can never cease to exist. That's what he lays out in broad strokes in his Parish on Mishnayos. In the Mishnah Torah, he pushes this idea a little further, adds a few other details that are worth noting. The first is that this first principle is not something that you have to have more than emunah in this principle. You actually have to know it. You have to verify it as true. That this mitzvah and the other that this is actually a mitzvah. In fact, the first three ikarim are mitzvah sases. These are positive commandments that you have to actually believe and do in some way. And we're going to spell out what that means for him. That Hashem is omnipotent. He knows everything. He knows all of man's actions. And that's more or less what the Rambam adds from the Mishnah Torah. So we kind of get hit with two big snags. We're going to deal with just one today, but the two big snags are, well, if it's a mitzvah to believe in God, and this is one of the fundamental principles of faith, well, it's kind of funny. Like, it's almost like a chicken or an egg problem. Like, I have to believe in God, but that's a mitzvah to believe in God, and God commands my belief, but I can only actually buy into the legal system if I believe in him. Well, how can belief be a law? You need to have the starting position be that is almost like you have to believe in God first, and then you can start having commandments. Then you can start having laws. But the Rambam lumps it together. That's problem number one we're going to be dealing with today. Problem number two we're going to tackle next week. I think this is a cool idea. The last thing that the Rambam throws in there in the Mishnah Torah is that God has to be. God can't cease to exist. This was also in his Parish Mishnayos, but God can't cease to be. Well, wait a second. God can't do something? In this first principle, we're limiting God's ability to do stuff. According to the Rambam, there are things God cannot do. So we're going to tackle that problem next week. Can God commit suicide? Rambam says no. Okay. So to resolve this first problem, this chicken before an egg problem of, if it's a law, first I have to believe there's a lawgiver. It can't be simultaneous that I'm doing both. Well, it seems like the way, if we look at more in Nevuchim, the Rambam there seems to outline that really this first mitzvah, it's not so much believing in God as much as proving God exists. That, like I said, the first three ikarim are things that you can prove based on logic, based on human reason. There's a mitzvah of chakira. So it doesn't exactly save us from this problem. Because well, what's our starting position? We'd have to fundamentally kind of suspect God exists in order to investigate if God exists. My dad, I loved this. Every Sunday, that's when I grew up in Iowa, so it was, strong Protestant, strong Christian, state. And Sunday was the day that missionaries would come by. So my dad would invite them all in. He had no problem. Yeah, sure. So he'd invite them in, and I always felt sorry for these guys because I knew where it was going, and they did not. And they're usually young guys, dressed in a white shirt and black pants. Those are the Mormons. Yes, yeah.
They come to my dad's house.
Yeah, sure. When I visit, people think I'm Mormon, and then they see the kippah. It's like, oh, wait a second. And the conversation would basically get to the point where, belief in Jesus, that's really important. You got to do that. And my dad would kind of whittle them away to the point where, yeah, okay, fine, and okay, and if they don't believe in Jesus, well, they are no matter what they do, no matter how good of a person it is, no matter what great stuff they've done, Bono, who is doing so much raising money for saving children in Africa. And that's good work, but good thing Bono believes in Jesus, because if he didn't, he'd go straight to hell. That's Christian theology in a nutshell. So my dad would kind of put it like this, what happens if, people in the deep heart of Africa, they've never heard of Jesus? It's not their fault.
Really?
Are they going to hell? Things got really uncomfortable then. Because yes, the answer according to Christian doctrine is yes, they all go to hell. Sucks to be them. Didn't get a shot. So we're confronted with this problem. How can you, my dad's kasha is in front of us. Great, we have a mitzvah aseh of chakira. Well, why would we ever start doing chakira? Why would these people in the deep heart of Africa ever start investigating the existence of God if they had no notion of the existence of God? We're not born blank slates. It used to be early on in the beginnings of psychology that people were kind of thought of as being something called in Latin a tabula rasa, an empty slate, and that in our lives we learn everything from the moment we're born on. And that's just simply not the case. People are not blank slates when they're born. A good way of thinking about it is we're born with this sort of like fundamental immature structure in our genetics. That even when it comes to morality, there's a starting position of what we find moral and not moral. We don't just learn morality; we're born with it. And what ends up happening is, where you're born, nurture develops these inborn structures, and to tip it all off, the final stage of your development as a person is, what life narrative do you end up constructing for yourself? We all tell stories of who we are to ourselves, and it's these three that make you different from the people around you. Your genetic code, where you grew up, and the stories you tell yourself. And the experience of religion is something inborn in every human being. That's really cool. Every person has a genetic predisposition to transcendence and awe, in a religious sense. Transcendence is basically the experience of losing yourself. And we all experience this. It's kind of neat. Whenever, you're at a dance party and you just, dancing with other people, mimicking the same motions with people. It's like you get lost in the experience. Well, you're not just getting lost in the experience, you're getting lost with everybody else. They also have this is a little less relevant to you guys, but a lot of people who go through military training and combat, they also develop this sense. They don't give up their lives for God and country. Well, they kind of give up their lives for God, but they lose their sense of identity. It's not so much, I want to help my friend, but there's no difference between them and their friend. There's something bigger than themselves. That's transcendence that people are able to tap into. And recognition of awe is basically whenever we're confronted with something that is just too big to understand and we try and make sense of it. Usually we have this experience in nature. You know, whenever you go out hiking in the beautiful mountains and you're just like, that's amazing. You can't quite put it into words. You try to do it, but as soon as you start putting it into words, you lose the amazingness of the experience. That's fundamentally a religious experience. We also have this when we're at like peak performances. You know, you guys ever hear of Maslow? He was an early psychologist he had Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and he kind of spells out, well, what do you need to be a person who has a worthwhile life? And he kind of starts out the base as, well, you need to have food and water, and you need to have shelter, and you need to have a family, and you need to have a community. At the very peak is self-actualization. That's the experience of awe. You guys have probably had this experience whenever you get intensely focused on something you're learning or you're really paying attention to something. You're engrossed in it. And you don't quite realize you've lost your identity, that you're just so focused on this thing, until somebody comes in, knocks, and just startles you. You just kind of get... You guys have this experience? That you're experiencing a small taste of awe, as Maslow was describing. You also get this, and I'm not advocating it, because it could go really wrong really fast, but psilocybin is a psychedelic substance that triggers the genetics of our religious selves. So you have this experience, and it's people who have this experience. They stopped researching in the United States for a long time. They just started again. But early on, when they were playing around with psychedelics, people who would participate in the research programs would say that their religious experience that they were having was like the top 3 most important experiences of their entire lives. And they were being given very small substances. And it's not that the substance makes the experience, it's triggering something within us that's already there. We're experiencing God because we're able to experience God on a genetic level.
Does it create a chemical reaction? I don't understand that. How does it trigger?
There's so little research, we don't know. The best we know is that it's somehow turning on. It's turning on these genetic structures we already have. That's the best we got right now. But I mean, the research is amazing. With one use of psilocybin, people who are hardcore smokers recover from smoking. It's 85% of them recover from smoking with one experience. It's unheard of. That's
How is this
that's nuts.
Cold turkey right
because
from
their whole life means something so much different because of their experience. Now, don't get ahead of yourself. I don't want the school getting back to me that I'm encouraging drug use. But with the guy who discovered LSD had a very different experience. He discovered it by accident. This is a man-made psychedelic, and so I think he was a Swiss scientist. I think
psilocybin is man-made or LSD?
Yeah, no, LSD is. Okay. Psilocybin you find naturally in South America, places like that. It's a chemical substance in different mushrooms and things like this. Well, he was I forget what he was researching. He had nothing to do with psychedelic drugs. But when he's working in his lab, this cute little 60-year-old guy, and a little bit spills on his hand. Oh, okay, wash it off. And he gets on his bike and he's riding back home after work. When all of a sudden the mouth of hell opens up and tries to consume him, the guy nearly had a heart attack trying to escape the devil devouring him. I mean, that was his trip.
Poor guy had a really bad
He had a very bad trip, and that was the discovery of LSD. So
Cool.
Yeah.
It's so sad.
God, poor guy. All right, kids, don't do drugs. That's my warning. But okay.
Drugs will go to hell.
Yeah. Either intense religious experience or hell, which is also kind of an interesting religious point. Is both exist. About 10% of people have that experience. But it's something to think about before you get involved. Okay, we have in our very bones this inclination that there is such a thing as religion, there is such a thing as God. But anywho, okay, so let's back up the train here. So that's the Rambam. That's Rambam's position. It's legitimate to have the mitzvah of discovering God because you have it in your bones. You already suspect His existence. And as soon as you ask the question, oh, is there something going on with this whole religious thing? The next logical question any person ought to ask is which one? You start chakira, you start research, and you will eventually find Judaism. You will eventually find your path that way. That's how the Rambam, I think that's more or less how the Rambam would have to justify himself. Now this position is not agreed upon by other Rishonim. Rabbeinu Kreskis and the Tashbets, they didn't feel comfortable with this idea that belief in God is a mitzvah. They would assert that's a starting position. The only way for the halachic process to begin is if you believe in God. Until you believe in God, for you there's no such thing as a mitzvah. You have to have a lawgiver first to have laws. That's the side they come out on. And while it might be that it's in our bones, believing in God and believing in religious concepts, well, who says you'll ever actually find Judaism? Why should you ever be held accountable? This is my dad's kasha. Why should you ever be held accountable if you are living in the deep heart of Africa and have no way of discovering Judaism? Well, why should you not have a chelek in olam haba? Another way of thinking about this is that they're making the argument that free will has limits. Free will is determined by what you believe. And whatever you believe will enable you to have choices. To have a choice, you have to have two things in front of you, says the Tashbets and Rabbeinu Kreskis. You have to have full agency of your life. Well, if you're missing one, just because I have a funny feeling in my tummy, one option's gone, except for this funny feeling. Well, who says you're able to, who says that's free will? That's not agency. Maybe it's a tummy ache, misinterpret it. So according to their position, not believing in God is not a justifiable or just reason for a person to be denied eternity. That's a pretty good idea. I like their opinion. But there's something to be said for the Rambam. And I think this very much has to do with what I touched upon earlier in the course, is that it's very easy to run away from feeling uncomfortable. And if you don't find that edge, how I said that if you're not just falling apart a little bit, not a lot, you don't want to be not like an LSD trip, gates of hell, let's leave those closed. But if you're not coming apart a little bit, you're not encountering God. You're not holding religious ideas. You're not exploring. And exploration is the fundamental thing that makes us human beings. So it's like, okay, fair enough, you have to have two choices in front of you to exercise free will, but man, you're born to explore. Get with the program. I think those are the two positions. And I think it's hard to come out on one side. Either one is not the full picture. Getting back to Elu ve'elu. Something to struggle with. I think we'll leave it there. Any questions? We're good? If you're good, I'm good. All right. Take it easy, guys.